Good morning. Good morning, y'all. Welcome to Calvary Church on this gray and gradually rainy Sunday morning. Glad for those of you who are making your way into the room and for those of you who are joining us online. It's a delight to be in this conversation today, and I'm really glad that you're here. I'm very glad to be meeting Martha Park in person and in the physical flesh, because I've been reading her story, and in the way that it's kind of maybe creepy sometimes, you start to feel like you know a person, but you haven't ever met. But let me tell you a little bit about her before we get started. Martha is a writer and an illustrator. She's a local girl made good. She grew up in Memphis and went off into the world and received her MFA at Hollins and has worked in many places and came home just on what we didn't know, what none of us knew was the eve of COVID in those years right before there, to be with her family at a particularly, at a juncture, at a hinge point in her father's life, and thus it became in her own family's life. Her dad is a minister. This is going to figure in her stories. What we're talking about today is her new book, World Without End, which Kat is out in the lobby, in the available to you. It's a beautiful collection of essays, sliding in that space between, kind of certainly memoir, certainly your own experiences, ground and are the foundation of things, but also you're going to learn so much about the world, about the state of the environment that we're in. You're going to learn about biblical studies. You're going to learn a lot of other things through the lens of her own story. So I am really glad. So this conversation is happening today, really courtesy of Nathan Brassfield, who I feel like needs to get a shout out. He's off in California this morning. And maybe even watching online, because he was pretty devastated to not be here with his friend Martha, who's also connected to the larger Memphis community through her work at Memphis Theological Seminary, which is, I think, the source of y'all's friendship. Is that grounding? Anyway, Nathan came to me a couple months ago and was like, here's the thing. I'm going to tell you about this book, and it's not because she's my friend. It's because it's great. And he was right. It's rich and beautiful, and I'm so glad. And we're the recipient. We're catching her in the middle of your world tour of this book tour that she's been on every day. You've been in a different town around Nashville and Oxford and Birmingham. Yeah, so circling back home. So we're lucky and glad to be in this conversation. So this book is called World Without End. I just walked out of our Right One morning first service of the day, and we said this phrase 3 times in one liturgy. It was in an earlier part of the service, and then it's the concluding line of our Right One Eucharistic prayer, World Without End, and it is a part of the final blessing prayers at the very, very end of the service. So this echo of what's coming is there. So would you talk a little bit about where that phrase comes from in your history and story, and how it became the kind of grounding of this beautiful book?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My book is called World Without End. Coming from my tradition, I grew up United Methodist, and in the book I said that was a line from the doxology, and my dad told me it's from the Gloria Patri, but he told me like a week after the edits were due, so it's wrong. But I just always loved the song. I loved the sound that the words made together, and I loved that the musical notes themselves, like the way we sang it together, sounded kind of like an incantation or something that we weren't totally sure of. You know, World Without End, it's kind of like this hope put out into the world. And a lot of the book is about different perspectives on apocalypse, on the future, on climate change. And so to have this line from within my denomination that felt at once kind of like it was refuting the idea of apocalypse, but kind of like hedging a bet, felt like the right energy for me in this collection. And did you want me to talk some about how it came to be? So I moved back home in part to attend my dad's church for his last year as a minister. And I thought I was writing kind of a memoir about that time and figured out pretty quickly that I'm not a memoirist and I don't have that much to say about myself, and was starting to feel kind of weird about it. Like I was sitting in church and it was like my brain was watching me and hoping I was going to think some big thought, you know? And so I ended up really just starting to write stories about other people, and I was really interested in people involved in conservation in the South and working to save endangered species, and was really interested in the way that faith kind of shows, writing about myself or just within the church. It was important to me to kind of go out in the world and ask some of these questions too. So the book itself is kind of a mix of like personal pieces and then like reported essays, more journalism.
So we're going to come back to hope and church and the environment, especially when we talk about that This is Paradise essay, which I told you before, that's really been a hook for me. But I want to start, too, by just kind of laying out some of the landscape, no pun intended, of where we are, where we kind of find ourselves, and just this is maybe understood by most folks in the room and things like that, but just to kind of place where we are in terms of faithful conversations that are related to conversations around conservation and climate change aren't a given, that which side a person would be on, right? And this is part of what you're exploring is these different, you know, if you're coming from one tradition, then there's some hostility even to this conversation and others. So can you talk a little bit, can you kind of give us like the broad sweep of that, like where you have found conversations unfolding and in what ways? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. One thing I was interested in was kind of perspectives on climate change coming from different traditions. And there's kind of this assumption that like conservative white evangelical Christians resist climate action either because they are in denial of climate change or they think that climate change is kind of an end of the world that they're like longing for. And so I was really interested in where that assumption might be true and where it might not be telling the whole story. And one story I ended up reporting was about conservation cemeteries around the South. So they do like natural burial, and they bury people like in a shroud or like a pine box, and they use the money from burials to preserve land. And there were two cemeteries I went to that were really emblematic of this kind of conversation to me. The first was in South Carolina, Ramsey Creek Preserve. It's the first conservation cemetery in the whole country. And the people who founded it, Billy and Kimberly, got into this because of land conservation. They thought this is a way we can buy 100 acres and have a cemetery here, and that will fund us preserving this land. And what they expected was that their clientele was going to be environmentalists like them, people from the cities around there. And what they found is that a lot of their customers are evangelicals, people from like Assemblies of God, rural people, and they kind of ended up crossing this line that they hadn't even realized was kind of their expectations. And then the next cemetery I went to was owned by an evangelical church. And in their opening sermon announcing that they were going to open this conservation cemetery, they said, we're not going green because that's environmentalists and they're not Christian. But I was really curious about whether that was almost an assumption, like a protective kind of stance. Like it seemed to me that there was an assumption that they weren't going to be like allowed into environmental conversations because a lot of their beliefs were a little bit different. And it made me wonder if environmentalism and conservation is like expansive enough to include people who might be coming from a different belief set. And so what that was really interesting to me is that they're not claiming a mantle of environmentalism or being green, but they are conserving 12 acres of land in an area that would otherwise be developed. And so I think that's what I'm interested in, is these kinds of areas where there's been a boundary that's been kind of assumed, and that living in the world, living in community causes us to kind of cross those boundaries and maybe change our beliefs or our behaviors.
Okay, so can we just flag the sermon for today? Because that's actually, I mean, it's just a beautiful in conversation with a conversation about boundaries and where they belong and don't belong. So just flagging that for those of you who are going to 1030 church, pay attention. But I do, I mean, I think it's so interesting that when, again, like this kind of like, we're not green, we're not doing this to be eco-friendly. Uh-huh. And that is actually almost like you said, like a reverse defensiveness. Like, I don't want you to tell me I can't do this because I'm coming from here. There's a lot of layers to that.
Yeah, or if they're even, because the reasons they gave, it was interesting at this church, they gave 4 reasons for doing the cemetery. And the first one was protecting the environment. And they would say, we believe Jesus could come back any minute, but in the meantime, we need to be good stewards of the earth. But then they were kind of defensive about but we're not environmentalists. And it was kind of this, it was interesting to see them kind of navigate that tension. But it did seem like a kind of, if we're doing a thing that is environmental, but it's not necessarily, I asked, they're like, we're not going to try and meet the Green Burial Council standards because we're just representing dust to dust. It's like they want to be fully doing this from their faith, but they're doing an environmental thing. So it's like interesting to kind of watch them navigate that.
And how we've kind of put up these kind of false boundaries. I mean, again, that there is a, if you start from Genesis about being good stewards and good caretakers, I mean, there's a difference between the word being a steward and having dominion, right? Like the language matters. Yeah. But it almost sounds like the language matters in the same way from these kind of secular communities of like, we've put up language that keeps others out. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting to see that reflected both ways.
Yeah. And I think I'm really interested in places like that where there's tension that hasn't necessarily found a resolution, that people just have to figure out how to live in this murky space and not get to some other side where everything's clear. And I think that's the kind of space that those communities have found themselves in. They're like serving and having to interact with this kind of larger movement that they're not totally sure they feel comfortable with. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I love that murky space. So climate change is real. Just start there, and it's real in your text, right? Yes. It's real, full stop. And so, as a through line that you're kind of braiding together again these, like you said, more journalistic kind of essays about this is what's happening in the world of conservation. This is what's happening, and here's my own story. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about why you care? Why this is that, do you know how this came to be the place of, I mean, there's a lot of things to care about in the world, right? There's a lot of issues that could be shaping for us. How this, do you have a sense of how this became a shaping, guiding lens for you?
I think when my husband and I started talking about having kids, there was a kind of confluence of things where I was very anxious about what climate change would mean for our children. And as he and I were getting married, we started comparing the traditions we had grown up in, and he was raised evangelical in Kentucky. And I had assumed when I first met him that we had something in common because of that, and it was like literally every Bible verse meant different things to us. We didn't have any songs in common. Communion looked totally different, and it was really disorienting to think we had something in common and then to realize we didn't in a lot of ways. And one of those differences was talking about apocalypse, and I had been raised with this interpretation that the book of Revelation was like describing the end of a specific empire that happened in the past, and it wasn't a prediction for the future. And he had been raised with the idea that the book of Revelation predicted a future we were all kind of headed toward. And that, to me, it was like this crux of thinking about the world we grew up with, the unknown world we're heading toward, these differing visions of the future that are kind of baked into our understanding of faith. I think those all kind of like crystallize for me with climate crisis, like that kind of represents all of those things to me. I think you can look at climate change as a kind of apocalypse that will be the end of the world, or you can look at how I tend to see climate change as like at once the end of many, many worlds that we didn't maybe know we had to lose, all these endangered species, the seasons that are familiar to us, the weather and patterns that can be kind of assuring, but also an opportunity to create and build those many new worlds and to have this kind of apocalyptic imagination in the face of those endings. And so I think that's what kind of drew me to climate change, was like how all of those things converged on each other.
spirituality of that, that's part of it, that it's all woven. There's so much braiding that happens in your essays. I mean, in terms of, it reminds me of reading Annie Dillard, where it's like, I'm going to take this thread and this thread and this thread. And they seem very disparate, but then they entwine. And we're like, oh, no, we're having the same conversation, right? Just different metaphors or different, those kind of things. Yeah. So speaking of, let's talk about this tree in Florida.
Yes.
So right in the middle of the book is this essay called This is Paradise. And it tells the story of this one little tree that I had never heard of.
Yeah.
And this one little plot of land in Florida. And there's speaking of braiding threads together, there is a Noah story here in a lot of ways. And then there's a modern conservation movement. There's a conflict between these groups. So can you kind of ground it? Tell us a little bit about the pine tree.
Yeah, so there's this tree called I call it the Florida torreya. I've also heard it called the toria, but it's like this little sub-canopy conifer tree that is one of the rarest trees in the world, and it only grows in this little stretch of land in the Florida Panhandle along the Apalachicola River. And it has been attacked for a few years by this fungus that it can't fight off, and so it's not able to reproduce. And Hurricane Michael, in I guess 2018, really had a big effect on the population of these trees in Florida. So there's a group of conservationists that are kind of at odds with each other about how is best to save this tree. Some people think it needs to be saved in Florida. Other people think that it was actually a tree that grew much farther north and it got trapped in these ravines after the Ice Age, and that it needs to be manually evacuated north. And so there's kinds of this conflict over, do we invest in saving it here even though it's not doing very well, or do we try and get it to a cooler place where it can live? And then meanwhile, there's a second story going on here, which is crazy, which is in the 40s, there was this Baptist preacher and lawyer named E.E. Calloway who found this like petrified log, and it was a torreya, and he decided that it looked a lot like what he thought Noah used to build the ark, which seems like a big jump. But he started reading Genesis and looking around him, and he was like, this description of Garden of Eden sounds a lot like North Florida. And so he started looking at the maps that like the rivers that fed to each other, and he was like, the Tigris River is actually the Chattahoochee or whatever, and they all feed into the Apalachicola River, and that's where Noah and his family rode the ark out into the ocean. And so he ended up buying a bunch of land and opening this Garden of Eden theme park, and so people could come and see the Garden of Eden, and there were these great signs in the woods that said, like, this is where God discovered he was lonely. And the crazy thing was that he actually, so that land was eventually donated to the Nature Conservancy, and because it was one of the few parcels of land in that area that hadn't been developed for like industrial purposes, they were able to use like the seeds from the plants there to kind of like reforest a bunch of other land around there. So he was like, we do actually think of it as the Garden of Eden because it's done so much to restore this land. And so this was one of those places where it was like all those stories were so commingled with each other, and it was very interesting to me to have a discussion with people about saving this rare tree from the past that's going to have a really hard time living in the future that we've created, and to have this story from the past that is so influencing the way people see the place that they live. Like, some people really believe this was the Garden of Eden, like that was a part of their cosmology when they read the Bible, is that Genesis happened in Florida. And other people were like, seems kind of weird, but does it hurt anything if this is part of our understanding of this place, is that it's sacred? And it's like, I can't really argue with that. And so I think I kind of ended up being really persuaded by that way of looking around the world and thinking maybe paradise isn't some far off, long ago thing I can barely imagine. It might be where I am right now. And so, yeah, that ended up being one of my favorite essays to write. It's a really fun kind of cast of characters I got to meet.
It's an amazing cast of characters, and I think it's such a beautiful response to, even as you tell the story, like, you can't help but giggle a little bit, and, here we are with our intellectual understandings about everything, and we're like, oh, Mr. Calloway, but actually to receive that as an invitation to say, this is paradise, and this is paradise, and this is paradise, and is a very generous and beautiful way to respond to this kind of wackadoo story.
Yeah. I think it's so beautiful.
It's really lovely.
Yeah.
And so from there, we build and we meet. So Miss Reverend Calloway, the lawyer minister, who found Noah's Ark in Florida. I can't. I mean, I feel like such a. It's Florida man. Yeah. It's a Florida man story. Oh right, the Ark. Well, that Ark is in here too. Yeah, there's a trip to the theme park of the Ark as well. So you're going to need the whole.
We're
book.
covered.
That one is this is the original, Scott. This is the original, not a replica. So we have that, and that's in the 1940s. So that's now 80 some odd years ago. Getting crazier and crazier all the time. How time progresses. And then but then we're today. So then you start meeting the people who have the land. Nature Conservancy, the Atlanta group, the group from Botanical Gardens from Atlanta. This one sweet woman who's trying to figure out who she's aligned with.
Yeah.
And that, I think, speaks to what you were talking about earlier about these, like, where are the boundaries and whose team am I on? Her story of, like...
She's my favorite person
ever.
tell us about
it.
There's this woman named Donna Wright who I reached out to her years ago, and she was, like, acting like I was going to interview her about, like, a CIA Black Ops operation. Like, she was so intense about it, and she was very cagey, wasn't sure if I could use her name. It took forever to talk to her on the phone, and it turns out that she had just bought some land in North Florida, and then there were some torreas there, and the implication I have is that her torreas are facing this fungus better than other trees, and so I think there's some interest in figuring out why her trees are doing better. But she just bought this land, and she was so intense about it. She said that the Atlanta Botanical Garden, who is breeding torreas in this safe house, which everyone compared to a Noah's Ark, which was really fun. She said that they asked to come see her trees, and she had actually had a double mastectomy that she rescheduled so that she could be there the day that they met her trees. And she said, if I'm going to miss this, I might as well be dead. And she was so intense about it. and she really just struggled with whether she wanted to be part of organized conservation movements at all. She said that she felt really disrespected by the scientists because she felt like they didn't care about her connection to these trees. And she also just knew a lot of beautiful stories about the trees, like the torreya tends to grow by this yew tree that produces the chemical that's used in chemotherapy for breast cancer, which her mom had died of and which she had. And so she was really connected to this tree on this kind of personal, emotional level, and she felt like the scientists didn't take enough time to kind of shepherd her through this process. So she had eventually cut herself off from that process, and then by the end of the story, she had actually had a total change of heart and put her land in a conservation easement that was donated to the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. And so she's told me at the end, like, I know this means you'll never be able to step foot on this land and meet these trees, but I feel like it's the right thing to do. And I was just really moved by what an intense struggle it was for her to know how best to be a steward of these trees she cared for so much. And I think there's that kind of like a spiritual connection to place that was the thing I found so exciting about so many of the people I talked to.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, even just listening to you describing that, I mean, I'm thinking about whether for any of us it's a torreya tree or not, but the thing that we love the most, and then how do we preserve it, protect it, make sure that it's here in the future. I mean, those are competing values. I mean, just as a mom, like the things that I love the most that I want to keep safe, but I have to send out into the world. I mean, all of this is, I mean, it could be, we could substitute in, you know, everybody's got something in their heart that they're like, this is the thing that and then I'm conflicted, right? And I have to trust, and I have to wonder. I mean, like, again, it seems a little obscure until you realize, oh no, this is universal. This is, everybody's got a piece of land, a person, a story, a work, a project. That when do we kind of block everybody out, and when do we open ourselves up?
Yeah, there's a risk there, and I think watching people navigate that is really moving.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this story, we've already so there's the actual Noah's Ark piece of the story, and then there's this metaphorical idea of modern day Noah's Arks. And those of us, some of you, all of us are Memphians. The story of Carrie Fowler, who is another local boy made good, who has the seed vault up in, I want to say Norway, but that's not right. Scandinavia, somebody who knows.
Is it in Iceland? Or
Iceland?
I don't know.
It's Greenland. It's somewhere up where it's really cold all the time. It says, I did not do my research. Norway, thanks, Dave. Yeah, you just Google that over there. Science professor from Rhodes to the rescue. Right, but we see these ancient stories that we have that we hold as people of faith. These are our scriptural stories, and however we interpret, them, again, like the conversation you're having with your husband about like every verse is actually interpreted differently.
That means what to you?
Well, it means what to you? The Noah's Ark story means what? And then we have these very secular scientific communities using that as the best way to understand what we're trying to do here. Is a seed vault, is two of every kind, so that if something happens, these are preserved, and then we can repopulate the earth. I mean, it's the Noah story. And just so the layers of all of that, I mean, it's fascinating. And the ark itself as a metaphor, and anyway, so I could, yeah.
Well, I think what's interesting about the Ark, too, is in the beginning of the book, I go and visit the Ark Encounter in Kentucky.
It's a different essay altogether, but also fantastic.
But that's such a specific, it's like this, and it's like walking into an interpretation, that's it's very set in stone. It has strict boundaries, and it's like there is one way to interpret this story. And it's not often that you can just like walk into somebody's brain in that way. And the story of Noah's Ark seemed to mean something really different there. And one of the things I was really interested in was like on TripAdvisor, everybody that had been to this giant Noah's Ark posted pictures of them in front of the giant door on the side. And I couldn't figure out like, what do they like about the door? And we were there wandering around, and I started to get this feeling like the comfort in the story of Noah's Ark was that like you were one of the people that would be let on the boat. And like the flip side of that is like everybody else is not. That's what it felt like, that kind of interpretation was like. There was a quote from one of the founders of Answers in Genesis that owns this Noah's Ark attraction, and he said that there was no neutral place between biblical literalism and atheism. And it's this very hard line that to me felt like that door either opening to you or being shut in your face. And Noah's Ark that story had never felt like that to me before. And so I think I'm also just really interested in how many different versions of these stories can we encounter, and how many different meanings do they have for people, and where do those meanings lead people?
Yeah. So one of the things that you tell us as we start reading, that you're coming home to spend this year with your father, and that you're very candid. This is the thing about any piece of it, if it's not all memoir, it's a little bit memoir.
Yeah.
About your own faith journey, right? Like of where you are. You were raised in the church, married this person at this stage of your life, have had these educational experiences, these life experiences, and you're trying to figure it out at the start, and we follow you, and then we learn all these other stories. But as you now think, just for today, doesn't have to be binding, but like when your take now on a Noah's Ark experience, the Noah's Ark, the Ark experience in Kentucky, of like finding your way between biblical literacy and atheism. Where are you these days?
I think there's a lot of good places between those two poles.
Yeah.
I think what's been really moving to me is that I think the process of writing this book was kind of mapping like a faith journey. And I didn't want it to feel like a collection of like essays that were just kind of thrown together. I wanted to take a reader on that journey as well. And I start out with just the experience of growing up with a dad who told stories, whether they were from his own life or from scripture, that could really change what they meant throughout the course of his life, through the context, how he's telling these stories. The meanings of those stories could change a lot over the years, and none of those meanings necessarily had to be a definitive meaning. They could all exist together. And I think that through writing this book and through all the other life experiences that have accompanied the past few years, I've kind of found a version of faith that for me very much is entwined with that sense of change and of multiple meanings and possibility. And I think one of the things that the differences between my husband's and I, like the theologies we were raised with, was he was raised with this idea of like that I'm not of this world. Like he was raised with the idea of the rapture and like that this world was kind of a shell of like the world that was going to come. And I think for me, it's been really important to reclaim how beautiful it is to have a faith that not only feels very attached to this world, but is like, we are of this world. Like this is a world where we are a creature amongst many other creatures that we're called to steward. And I don't like to think of those as like a binary necessarily, but I do feel like there's a version of faith that's being offered to people that is calling them away from caring for this world. And it feels meaningful to me to draw closer to a tradition that's not offering that up as an answer.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And I think even as you're talking a little bit about understanding that stories have multiple meanings, that words change, and where we are changes, and so then we read them differently. So, which makes me think again. I'm still in the "This Is Paradise" essay
Me
because
too, always.
It's just so chock full. So one of the things that you talk about something that can have multiple meanings. This is on page 115 in the ARC, which may not line up to yours exactly, but you're talking about hope.
Oh yeah. Do you want me to read this?
Yeah,
I don't know how much more time we have, but I can read this.
Let's read that. Yeah, read. Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to decide how much of this to read. Okay, I'm just going to start here. In my conversations with people trying to save the Terea, I had noticed specific moments in which they seemed hopeful for the tree's future. But perhaps more often, they seemed to do the work without much hope at all. Instead, the work itself was its own remedy against despair, against assuming that all was already lost. Talking to them, I began to get a sense of hope on a different scale, with an aperture opening beyond a specific tree's specific fate. Perhaps something like what the writer Adrian Shirk calls theological hope, which she defines as not simply longing for Eden, but a longing that is mobilizing, resistant, that leads us to each other, and maybe to a garden, even if it is a long way off. This kind of hope moves beyond the survival of a single endangered tree, even perhaps our own individual survival, to a greater reconciliation. All souls descend a ladder from heaven to the world, writes Abraham Joshua Heschel. Then the ladders are taken away. If this is true, perhaps the goal is to quit looking around for another ladder, for our escape from this world to a paradise that we vaguely, achingly remember, and instead tend to the world around us as if it were or could be paradise itself. What we witness now is not the end of the world, but the end of many worlds, perhaps more worlds than we knew we had to lose. The world of the American chestnut, the white bark pine, the maple leaf oak, the eastern hemlock, and one day, perhaps very soon, the world of the Florida Terea. But as the Terea's extinction has become arguably more likely, people devoted to the tree have become less willing to admit it. They're compelled instead to build whatever arcs need to be built.
Thank you. Yeah. So just really struck and moved by this this conversation about hope and what it means to live and act hopefully, even when it's a lost cause, right? Mm-hmm. Even when the Terea is probably not going to make it. Mm-hmm. And how that is an antidote to despair. I mean, it's just so, instead of, so Rebecca Solnit is a beautiful essayist, and she wrote this book called Hope in the Dark. And she talks about not optimism, but hope. And she really pushes people to separate those words, that optimism is, it's all going to be fine. And hope is not that. It might not be fine. Mm-hmm. And I'm still going to get up in the morning and go check on my tree, and I'm still going to move and live and make choices that are reflective of my values. And so I really, really appreciated, I'll put my glasses back on, at the start of that, that there were moments where they seemed hopeful for the tree's future, but they often seemed to do the work without much hope at all. I don't know why that seems relevant to me these days, but it does. This sense of doing the work, and that hope kind of I don't know, it's not distinct and separate, but it's, I don't know, help me out here. In terms of like this sense of, I don't know how this is going to go. Holding that's just the humility of, I don't know how this is going to go, and I know that this is what I'm called to do.
Yeah, and it's like the only way we know that the tree's not going to make it, or that whatever other problem isn't going to work out, is if we sit on our hands and don't do anything. And so I think hope is like a mobilizing force, was really moving to me. And also that it kind of decenters like how you feel about the future and emphasizes like what are you doing acting toward the future, what kind of world are you trying to bring into being. And I think for me, I spend a lot of this time, like a lot of this book, I'm thinking about a lot of things, and there's something about whenever these arguments are kind of brought into like an embodied way of being in the world, that's always kind of what I'm looking for, just to get me out of my own brain.
Right.
So it was kind of this, it was nice that they're like, I don't know if this tree is gonna make it, but I'm gonna do everything I can.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do appreciate that, like, we could have all these like heady arguments all day long up here, but there's a tree.
Mm-hmm.
There's a this. There's a, it's right in front of me. So this is what.
Yeah.
So I do want to offer a time of, like, I know not everybody, maybe very few of you have had a chance to read these beautiful words, but just in the conversation, if there are reflections or pieces of her story that have been resonant for you, or things that you wonder more about, we open it up a little bit for.
So thank you. That was wonderful. I was kind of struck by what you were talking about, the pictures in front of the door of the ark, and the sense of comfort that we're the ones getting on the ark. And I feel like in this country, with our relative wealth, to the rest of the world, that we are the ones getting on the ark, and the rest of much of the world is not. Vietnam, the Philippines, African countries. And that part of the struggle of living in this time and living in this place is bearing witness to that. And now I'm feeling this fear, kind of, that our narrative of being so certain that we're the ones getting on the ark is going to be strengthened as we watch the rest of the world. Many parts of the world struggle more than we will in the coming decades. Do you foresee that being a problem, and strengthening that kind of certainty that maybe we should not be having in these times? And if so, how do we combat that narrative?
I think that's one of the, like, when I write an essay about the Ark encounter, I'm not ever going to write an essay saying, like, this place was really spooky and seemed evil and I'm worried, And so I feel like I'm always trying to keep, like, a sense of uncertainty at the center, because I'm afraid of that kind of certainty, what it does to a person. But I think the thing that I found the most unsettling about the kind of theology at the Ark encounter was, first, that it's this like multi-million-dollar enterprise that's making a whole lot of money off of a specific worldview, and then that worldview is so it's so black and white, it's so binary, it's so good versus evil. There's no shades of gray, and they're selling the answer that's going to make sure you're on the boat, And I do worry about that kind of sense of like confirmation when a lot of the world is suffering because of the ways that we in this country have chosen to live and have exploited people. I do worry that that's going to like serve as a tool of saying, we were right, everyone else is suffering. I do think it's a really dark way of, it's like kind of a math about climate change, where it's like, it kind of reminds me of the like drowning the witch thing. If you're trying to figure out who's a witch, like it's kind of like, well, if this is the end of the world, then there's nothing we can do about it. And if it's not the end of the world, then it's God's will and there's nothing we can do about it. It's very self-defeating. And I just think there's something about the kind of melding of this kind of theology with politics that just feels like the perfect storm for what we're living through, and that that kind of binary thinking and that black and white thinking is like the exact opposite of what we need to find our way out of this. And I don't have any answers for how that's going to look better. I'm just like share the fear about it. The way it can be so perfectly applied and mapped onto politics is really scary.
Thank you. I appreciate a lot of what you said, and you put words to things that I've thought. One thing that I appreciated was when you spoke about loss and the loss of worlds and things that we may not miss them until we realize they're gone, or maybe we won't realize it at all. Think of, if we think of the biodiversity crisis and all of the extinctions that have happened that we sort of haven't seen. And I think one thing that is, I think, particularly difficult about observing the climate crisis is that it is self-induced. And so, we can look throughout, not just human history, but, going back to the beginning of the earth, and, change is part of it, right? These dramatic changes. I mean, even Ice Age to, 20,000 years ago, there was an Ice Age. And so I think what's sort of, so I'm just wondering if you could say something about that challenge of, seeing that it is us doing the thing that is causing this loss.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot with my son. I think when I started this book, I was thinking of myself as like inheriting faith from my family. And over the course of the book, I started thinking of myself as someone who was passing on faith to my children. And one of the things I just find so troubling is when my son wants to read a story of like Noah's Ark or Jonah and the whale, and there's this depiction of like a storm being God punishing us. And I'm always trying to, he can tell I'm editing a story as I read it to him. But I think one of the things as he's getting older is trying to figure out not only is natural disasters not God sending us a message, but that it's us sending us a message, and how to kind of convey that to a kid. I think I find that really, it's hard to when I'm thinking about kind of apocalypse and the stakes of everything, not to then create a newly terrifying version of faith for my kid. But I think the argument that is kind of put forward by a lot of climate change denial is there's been these changes before, and so this is just another one of those changes. And I think there's been a lot of research that more facts about the acceleration of change and how it's tied from the Industrial Revolution to now, it's doesn't necessarily convince people. But I do think what I've seen has some power to change people's way of living is that sense of attachment to the world and the sense of the creatures that we're harming and stand to lose. And I think that's what I'm really interested in is if arguing with people or presenting them with more facts isn't going to change their minds, what will? And I think a lot of it is changing people's hearts and way of being, even if you're not changing their minds necessarily.
Thank you for what sounds like a fabulous book. I'm
Thanks.
Looking forward to getting it. There's a woman named Amy Jill Levine who is in Nashville and at Vanderbilt. Early on, when I started trying to teach the book of Genesis, learn about the book of Genesis, I listened to some tapes that she had, and when she got to Noah's Ark, she said, "I cannot stand this character." She said, Abraham argued with God when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Noah said, "Sure, just call the animals." And wherewithal, you can ask my children, I took down all the Noah's Ark things that I had around the house. So they always look and say, "Mom, why did you put away Noah?" But I was thinking about you with your son. In reading a story like that, we could say, I wonder why Noah didn't question God, which gives us, I think, and gives our children the idea that we're all open. That's part of creativity and life, is asking questions.
Yeah, there's a rabbi in my book that I quote. Their name is Rabbi Jericho Vincent, and they wrote a really cool reflection about, it was kind of a midrashic interpretation of Noah as being a righteous figure only for his time, and that his kind of righteousness could be improved upon by not only worrying about saving his own family, but saving all the children, all the families. And I really like that perspective of like these characters that challenge God to have a better morality or to care more, and where we've failed at that over time. It's interesting because the Ark Encounter also had this exhibit about like the danger of children's book depictions of Noah's Ark. And they were saying we shouldn't make this look cute and cuddly because it's about God's wrath. But that's such an interesting, it's like two ways of challenging the character of Noah. And again, like one feels way spookier to me and one feels more like instructive, I guess. Yeah.
Maybe one more and then, yeah.
I'm just glad we're all editing the Bible for our children,
Yeah.
because
We
my
are all.
my daughter's 4, and she's noticed like in the illustrations that there's not a lot of girls. So I'm just, and then when you read like the story of Eve, I'm very quick to be like, but it's just not her fault. Like this is how it sounds, but it's not. I'm just glad to know we're all doing that.
We're all doing it. Yes. We are all in it together, for sure, for sure. And glad to have a new person in it with us. I'm so glad to be in this conversation with Martha Park. Our friends from Novel are out in the comments with this book. You're going to want to read. There's so much more, and we kind of focused on 1 or 2 pieces, but it's a beautiful, beautiful collection. So thoughtful and so grateful that you've been here today.
Thank you so much.
We'll see y'all in church.
Thanks, y'all.